Hello, I am Sandra Boyce, Media Resource Officer in the Ministry of Education, Technological and Vocational Training. And today, sharing with us is Dr. Christopher Hackett, former Ambassador of Barbados to the United Nations. Welcome, Dr. Hackett.
It's good to be here.
Good to have you. Today, we're going to be sharing with you about your life experiences, about how young persons can become involved in United Nations service, and about what you can offer those persons who may be interested in doing this. So let's begin by sharing about your early life. Tell us a little bit about who you are. Who is Dr. Christopher Hackett?
Dr. Christopher Hackett, it's good to be here. A national of Barbados, grew up in Barbados, attended primary school at West Hall in King Street, the city. Went on to Harrison College, where I spent the next 8-9 years doing my secondary education. Taught for a year at one of the secondary schools in Barbados, foundation school. And then I went out to the University of the West Indies at the Mona campus, where I took my first degree in economics.
Now, I'm listening to what you're sharing, and this is the 1960s. So we are well aware that education at that time would not have been free. And so could you share with us what did it mean to you as a young person having this opportunity to be able to go to a secondary school, to be able to travel to go to university? How did that impact your experience?
Well, it affected me in one main way, which was that I needed to be certain that at the end of my studies, I had something to show for it. I didn't have the luxury of fooling around. There was a lot of money spent by my parents to get me to school. This includes the secondary school, because in the early days of my secondary education, there was a fee that was charged. And they certainly, I almost am tempted to use the word, deprive themselves of certain other things in life to ensure that a good education was provided to me and my siblings. But I was at that point in life where education was not free. Then when I went on to the University of the West Indies, it was another occasion where they also were paying. Unfortunately, despite my best efforts, I was not successful in getting a scholarship. But what I did receive was a grant. Well, actually, it was not a grant. It was a loan from the government of Barbados through the revolving loan fund, and that did help significantly to cover the cost of a large part of my education.
So you've gone to university, and from there, where did you go?
I should add, after leaving the University of the West Indies in Jamaica, I touched base, or I was recruited, one of the earlier recruits in the government's Ministry of External Affairs. And in those years of the External Affairs, a number of staff were recipient of scholarships from the government of Switzerland. They were supporting the newly independent countries of the Caribbean to give them training, and I was the beneficiary of that. So I went off to the Institute of International Relations in Trinidad, the St. Augustine campus. And that was really where I had my first practical experience of studying various aspects of international relations for 1 year.
And I believe that opened the door to your exposure, to your interest.
It certainly did, because after leaving St. Augustine, I returned to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the authorities there, in terms of the permanent secretary, the minister, but soon after, I was back in Barbados for about 6 months or so. Then I was reassigned to the permanent mission of Barbados to the UN in New York. So I actually started out as a young diplomatic officer working in the ministry, in the permanent mission of Barbados as the second secretary.
And how old were you at this time?
Oh, good Lord, I have to make some calculations.
Roughly around?
Roughly, I think I must have been around 20, Could have been 25, I think it was. I mean, yeah.
That's pretty young.
In my mid-20s, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So you're a young 25-year-old man, roughly, and you are in New York.
That's correct.
Working with the Barbados
Permanent mission.
Permanent mission. And what kind of experiences did you get there that encouraged you to want to remain in the mission?
Well, the exposure that you had interacting with a number of other government representatives. Keep in mind that at that time, in the late 60s, 69, 70, there were a number of newly independent countries from the Caribbean and from Africa, one or two from Asia, but most of the newly independent ones were from Africa and the Caribbean. And the representatives there, we did get together, and it was interesting that we found ourselves sharing experiences. Many of our development challenges were somewhat similar, and therefore we were able to discuss and develop strategies for how we would represent the interests of our countries at the UN so that our countries could get the most out of that representation. So that was really an important development aspect for me, an aspect of my development, working closely with the representatives of the newly independent states of Africa.
Your love for Barbados and your desire to see Barbados thrive on the world scene, how did that affect your work in the mission?
Well, I was committed to helping Barbados. I have to admit that I did not stay in the mission sufficiently long for that help to be significant, because after just over a year, I did find an opportunity. I was recruited into the UN Secretariat itself in the Department of Economics. And in fact, and that was where I was able to, in my view, to help Barbados more. Because in formulating and administering technical assistance projects for developing countries, my area of focus at that time was Africa, but I had one or two other colleagues in that same department who were responsible for the Caribbean, and I was able, even back then, to ensure that some of the development challenges that I knew Barbados and the Caribbean countries were experiencing, I was able to get some concerns, included in projects that were being formulated to respond to the concerns of Barbados and the Caribbean. So that was one way in which I really ensured that I was able to give some help, to the Caribbean.
And so how many years did you eventually spend as the Barbados Ambassador to the United Nations?
After several years working in the UN Secretariat, that was just over 30 years, I did join the Barbados Permanent Mission as ambassador, more or less in a second phase of professional life. And I spent 6.5 years as ambassador representing Barbados at the UN.
And what were some of the experiences you encountered as ambassador for Barbados?
You may wish to keep in mind that the ambassador, or he or she, one of their major responsibilities is to, in common parlance, represent the interests of the country at the United Nations. In my briefings, it was clear that most of those concerns revolved around economic and financial. And that was where I spent most of my time in terms of meetings. Climate change became an important issue, and when added to economic and financial, then the whole issue of sustainable development, it expanded to sustainable development. But there were some of the issues that I got involved in at the United Nations on behalf of Barbados. And when I say involved, it could be a question of negotiating, ensuring that some of the priority concerns, for example, on climate change, are captured in the document that we may be negotiating. On the economic side, we spent quite a lot of time trying to formulate a response to the OECD's concern about money laundering and the way in which that was negatively affecting Barbados and the countries of the Caribbean. There are some of the issues that we would have been involved in at the United Nations.
So Barbados and the other small island states do have a voice. And how do you see our young people being able to carry on that voice as they may look around and see what's happening globally?
Well, for one thing, the young people, not only now, but even back but when I was growing up, you need to be able to develop an understanding of the core interests of your country, of the countries that you represent. And once you are guided by that, then you can get involved in interacting with whether it is developed countries, staff within the UN Secretariat, but you register those interests and ensure that any documents that are being prepared would have those concerns reflected. I give you a specific example. While I was ambassador at the UN, there was a major UN conference that was coming up in 2005, what we call the United Nations Summit. I was fortunate to be one of the chairmen negotiating the outcome document for that conference. And although as chairperson I had to be neutral, at the same time in terms of Barbados's interests, but at the same time I was able to I needed to keep in mind that the interests of the developing countries needed to be reflected accurately, in that outcome document. That's one of the useful ways, the important ways that representatives, of a country like Barbados, that we can carry out our work. Yeah.
Share with us your ideas about how you were able to influence younger persons in training them about diplomacy, diplomatic life, representing the small island states, and any work that they were interested in at that level.
Interesting question, because after I had left office, one of the assignments I undertook was a diplomatic training program for young diplomats from small islands, the Caribbean and the Pacific. And I was able to draw on the experience I had gathered from representing Barbados, in New York at the UN headquarters. Essentially, I pointed out to them a number of key points. One, the need to be well prepared in terms of the substance of the matter you're covering. When it comes to negotiations, some techniques in terms of negotiating techniques. The need to be always alert, not to dismiss. They found this interesting, but not to be overly talkative. Sometimes you get more for your country out of listening and then making an intervention more or less at the appropriate time rather than a continuous talking. So techniques such as the ones I've just described, I did include as one of the nodules in the program that I was implementing at the School of Diplomacy, the University of the Australian National University in Canberra.
So you have a wealth of information, your experiences, the possibilities of what you can share with our young people. Those possibilities are endless. Yeah. Do you envision yourself continuing the diplomacy training, perhaps to young persons out there who might be interested in this field? What plans do you have for furthering this?
Well, to be frank, I'm at the stage now where my plan is really to reduce some of my activity, but you may wish to know that I still stand ready and willing to to offer some of my experience to young people. Last week I was in Trinidad and Tobago at the Institute of International Relations. While there, I did have some discussions with the director of the institute, and I've been invited, and we now have to come up with a sort of a program, but to at least offer myself, be available for some ad hoc lectures to some of the students So this is something that can very well happen, in the next academic year within the context of the University of the West Indies at the St. Augustine campus.
And you mentioned your book, and I'm sure that persons who are interested in this area will definitely find lots of information in your book. So tell us a little bit about the process of writing the book, what initiated the book, and where you envision the book will go.
Yeah. I wrote the book. There were two things that informed me about, or influenced me in writing the book. The first was a comment by a good friend of mine who has passed on, and many people in Barbados will certainly know of him, Harold Hoyt, the former managing director of the Nation group of newspapers. And he did say to me when I returned to Barbados, Chris, you must, record for posterity your experiences of representing Barbados at the United Nations. And that really did set me going, and I started to jot, some ideas down, started some drafting. Secondly, there was a group of students, and I made reference to this earlier, where I was conducting a training program for them from the Caribbean and the Pacific. And some of them were saying to me, Ambassador Hackett, you're telling us all of these interesting things about working at the UN, diplomacy. Why not put some of this, in book form that you could better share, with us and some others? So that was the second motivating factor. A third motivating factor was my early experiences at the UN as ambassador. I found that the representatives of the developed countries, they were ensuring that everything that they did, they spoke about, they wanted the interests of their countries to be reflected in any final outcome of the, of the decisions being taken at the even to the expense of small countries, developing countries. Yet, I could observe that the representatives of a number of small states were equally well prepared, some possibly even better prepared to represent or to deal with some of these issues than some of the representatives from the developed countries. What was lacking was the opportunities that these representatives from the smaller countries did have. So I did set out to ensure that I would be very, very active in the work of the organization on behalf of Barbados, and this is what I did. And so the moral of that story for me, which I'm imparting it now, is that if the diplomat from the developing country, from the small island state, is committed to representing his or her country well, you must be prepared to put in the time, whether it is in terms of participating in meetings, in negotiations, but the point is you must be there. And I did just that, and I have registered I've recorded those activities in the book, and I would like to think that Barbados as a country did benefit from that active involvement.
So let's speak a little bit about career opportunities for young persons who may come and speak with you. What are some of the opportunities that they can engage in as it relates to the things you've been involved in?
Well, there are a few different aspects. One of the ones that may seem maybe almost an automatic one, for anyone who has a great interest and has been successful in terms of certificates in languages, UN international related work would be an interesting option. In the UN Secretariat, there's always a need for persons translation, interpretation, and I don't know if people may consider it to be exciting, but one needs to recognize that interpretation, particularly, is a critical cog in the wheel of the working of the organization. Very often it is the way how representatives speak to other representatives through the interpreters. And therefore your work is extremely important, although you may be almost hidden behind a small room, but extremely critical for the effective, successful working of a meeting.
And I'm glad, before you go, I'm glad you mentioned this, because very often when we have our students doing languages, the options seem to be pretty limited in terms of what can I do with a language. So you've now suggested another avenue of persons who are studying languages to consider.
Yeah. Certainly interpretation, interpretation, translation. When, when I was involved, and I hardly think that much has changed since then, but there was at least a minimum professional ability to work, in at least 2 languages. But some of the interpretation people, can do more. You have to be able to interpret, into your own language and out of it. But as I said, it is the key aspect of international relations work where representatives of countries seek to interact with each other. Then yes, there's the, one may say, a more substantive part of it in terms of development work. I think a well-trained development economist, at least with a graduate degree, could be a good candidate for UN employment. The UN, UNDP, they do have, and they still do have, I would almost call it young professional type training programs where I think up to the level of 32 years, but the point is you can come in as a junior professional and get, your feet wet, on the ground for a few years before you then branch up to a higher level. Information on these types of opportunities are available. Everyone now talks about, the computer are available on the UN website. Persons like myself and others who have had experience at the UN, can certainly guide an individual a little bit more, but the information is there, and you could be pointed towards it. So that would be another area of, particularly on the development side. I think if one were to go on to do some specific studies in international relations, be it in international politics, international law, that certainly would be of additional help.
And you spoke a lot about your background in economics. How would a young person in the field of economics be able to participate in some career in the UN?
Well, once again, it is the question of developing your particular interests. There are many different aspects of economics, but the development economist, I think, has a good chance of being involved in technical assistance work, for example, which could mean UNDP, it could mean IMF, the World Bank. Those institutions that are often in a position to be providing guidance to developing countries. So development economics would be an important area, I think, to try to focus on.
Okay. And so you've had quite a record of visiting countries around the world. As a Barbadian, how would you assess your experiences there? What were some of the similarities you noticed between countries in Africa and Barbados in terms of its development? And then how can our young school children be exposed to the information that you have gained from those experiences?
Well, yeah, you're correct. I did quite a lot of traveling in relation to my work when I was in the UN Secretariat and subsequently as ambassador, but let us focus on the period of time when I was in the UN Secretariat. And a lot of it in Africa as well, since I was responsible for some countries in Africa, particularly those in East Africa. What I found was a number of countries that were experiencing dire poverty. Quite frankly, coming from a country like Barbados, even 30, 40 years back, I still found shocking some of the levels of poverty that I saw in some of the African countries. Things have improved significantly since then. Some of it I would like to believe based upon the the assistance and the guidance that institutions like the UN were able to offer the African leaders in helping to chart a development path for their country. So yeah, this is the sort of experience I'd be able to share. The type of projects, some of the elements of those projects that should be included. A lot of it, of course, would be related to the nature of the development of the country and the type of assistance that they're requiring. But based upon your own experience, you can certainly adjust the response, accordingly. Yeah.
So, do you have any advice for young persons who are young school leavers who are looking for experiences to represent their country, who have a love for Barbados, and who would like to be able to work on a global level?
Yeah. Forgive me if I return to the point of education, but I think that is essential. It is a question of staying the course, ensuring that you spend time at the tertiary level to at least get I would say a graduate degree. You have your first master's and then a graduate degree. In some, from my area of interest, some development work. A lot of what is happening now in today's world in terms of the computer and other techie devices, I think some exposure to those things will also be extremely valuable. I didn't experience that when I was in training, but I can see how that will be valuable as well. But programs in development economics, I think, would be essential.
Now, Dr. Hackett, you spoke a lot about education and the importance of education in helping our youth to be able to engage and perform on a global stage. But as I read through your book, I also noticed the importance of relationship building. And so I want you to speak to us about relationship building. And you particularly mentioned a breakfast club that was a part of your UN experience. So talk to us about that.
Yeah. Well, thanks for raising that question. I think I could best respond to it by emphasizing the importance of what I describe in the book to be group diplomacy, because it is really through participating in different groups at the UN that you have the best chance of advocating for and ensuring some success for your country. One of the groups in which I participated was the so-called Friday morning breakfast club. And it was a group of ambassadors. It was at the ambassadorial level, a small group, 20, 25 of us, and we met fortnightly on Friday mornings, and essentially to discuss issues that were coming up, had been on the agenda of the United Nations General Assembly, and this ran the gamut from economic and financial issues, the financial crisis, climate change, human rights, reform of the United Nations Secretariat. And it provided an opportunity for the ambassadors to register, well, not so much the formal positions of their countries, because at that time they would not have been a fixed position of the country, but you're registering views and you're exchanging views and you're seeking to really, at the same time, find out what could be the concerns of a particular country on a particular issue. These were all things that were discussed during those Friday morning breakfast discussions. And it enabled us, certainly enabled me, to then formulate what could be a desired policy position of Barbados, on some aspect of climate change, or some aspect relating to human rights, how one could respond to a human rights concern that may have come up, let's say from the Canadian government or from the Iranian government. While having this exchange with your colleagues, it also developed, collegiality, and therefore it was good not only for the issues that you had on the agenda for that particular morning, but it developed to almost an ability to maintain, friendships. You could approach them on some of the occasion, on some of the issue, and would expect, a reasonably, honest and frank response. I use the word reasonable because we diplomats, particularly at that ambassadorial level, we always recognize that there may be some high priority concerns that you, the ambassador, may not be able to share with another colleague. That is normal. That's the name of the game. But at the end of the day, you can certainly develop a sufficiently generalized understanding of the position of a country on a particular issue that you can then know how you can develop your country a response to it. Yeah.
And so these are skills that our young people must develop.
Group diplomacy is very important, and you need to recognize the importance of it and to participate and commit yourself to participating in it. It may not always be the Friday morning breakfast club at the ambassadorial level. There are a number of other groups. We call them, friends of a particular issue, where sometimes there's the technical experts who may get together to discuss aspects of a particular topic. But group diplomacy is very, very important.
And I'm glad you raised this idea because we have a lot of our colleges, as students are looking to go to college, a lot of our colleges are asking for these kinds of skills as well. And so it's not just academia is extremely important, but we want to make sure that our students are developing social skills and are able to communicate and discuss and put out there what their position is and to be able to receive someone else's position as well. And so it's really important that you mentioned that as a key area of our growth.
And I would like to hope that some of these things would be included in elements of courses that may be taught, whether it is a community college, whether it is a civics program. They still do have civics, at the within the sixth form of one of the secondary schools. But these things are important.
Now you've had a wealth of experience, and I'm sure there must be stories that you can share with us, perhaps some that have left an indelible mark on you, or some that are funny, or there must be some story that you can share with us.
Well, there are a few. Most probably, I could begin with two of them that linked to my work as a UN peacekeeper. As I said earlier, I did was invited to and did participate in two of the UN peacekeeping missions, one that was based in Jerusalem and the second one in Angola. In Jerusalem, I was the Chief Administrative Officer, CAO, as we call it in the UN jargon, for that mission that was based in Jerusalem. And essentially what we were doing there, we were seeking to keep the peace, to maintain the peace between Israel and its neighbors. This would have been after the state of Israel had been created, and also after things had become a little bit more difficult after the 6-day war. And so basically, my responsibilities were to ensure that the mission, we had all of the equipment that was necessary to maintain the peace. There were a number of observation posts that where we had the military personnel, staffing or manning those. They were all women at the time, so I used the word manning. And we needed to ensure that they had all the equipment, the requirements that they needed. One of the interesting things, it may seem to be a small point, but it was important, that came out in that mission was the importance of water for the Israeli nation. And water was a resource that was found mainly under the area that was then occupied or inhabited by the Palestinians. So yes, from a military point of view, there would be, or there could have been, many concerns for the political leaders in Israel for seeking to have some control over the occupied territories, areas. but water was an important sort of subset of concerns, because that was really where most of the water was located. I found that interesting. And as I said in the book, I don't know how many people would have been aware of that particular point that helped to, in my view, to guide the policy concerns, of the government of the day at that time. A second issue was also linked to my experience in peacekeeping, and that was when I had the tour of duty in Angola. I was in Angola to part of the UN team to develop, monitor, and observe the elections. This was going back to a period of 1992-1993. And not going into too many details, but the two sides the two political sides had been at war for the longest while. And this is an attempt to bring about some reconciliation. And we were preparing the two sides and their supporters, for elections. And we did that, we thought, at the UN pretty well, to the point where the elections were in fact held. I was responsible for liaising with many of the groups who had to be trained in executing the elections, and that was done quite well, and the elections were held. I was fortunate to be in the section of the country where the leader of the main opposition was located, Major Sabimbi. And we developed, he developed a relationship, with us, and he really relied on us a lot to ensure that that his men, his forces, were kept safe. But every now and again, there was an outbreak, between the two sides, and this eventually happened with some intensity after the elections had been held. And the location where we were in Wambo was overrun. All of our personal effects were lost, and we had to be brought back for safety, from Wambo, to the capital. A little bit scary, but as I like to tell my friends, it is good to be able to, to be here and talk about that experience. I remember the evening of the shooting. It was very, very close by, and some of us, we literally hid in wherever we could find what we thought was, if not safe, but something that was a solid place. And some of us went into a freezer that we had in the kitchen. We left the freezer door open, but at least we felt that was at least stop any stray bullets from penetrating. But we survived that night, and we saw some bullet holes in the tents, the next morning. But it is a story that you survive and you can talk about.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thankfully.
Yeah, thankfully. Yeah.
So, do you have any achievements that perhaps that stand out in your mind?
Oh, yes. I would say one that stands out, and I've also mentioned this in some detail in the book, is the opportunity I had to chair the negotiations for what in the UN jargon we call the outcome document for this major meeting in 2005. It was a meeting that covered a number of areas of work of the UN on the development side, on the political side, and on the reform of the UN organization itself. And I was the ambassador who was responsible for chairing the negotiations on the development side. And it was a difficult task, trying to get the support and understanding of the different delegations. And as I said in the book, there was just one country that provided us with the most difficult task, because the ambassador of that country did not support some elements of the draft that was in the outcome document. There was the element relating to what we in the UN call the Millennium Development Goals. And as the chairperson of the negotiations, the ambassador came to me and explained his country's position. And I had the difficult task of saying, well, but this is something that a number of other countries, would want there. So give me a chance, to discuss it with the President of the General Assembly, with the UN Secretary General, and see how best, your concerns could be, could be acted upon. And it really called, in my view, from I used some of my skills as a diplomat then. Anyhow, it eventually led to the UN Secretary General himself, who at the time was Kofi Annan, and he was able, at his level, to speak with the president of that particular country. It was the US. And Kofi Annan was able to point out the importance of the Millennium Development Goals to a number of countries around the world. And eventually, President Bush gave his support. Here we have a document that was difficult to negotiate, but by pressing, I may be unfortunate, by pressing some of the right buttons, I was able to get the document then endorsed unanimously, despite one big country creating that difficulty. An interesting part about that story, and then I can end here, is that the whole concern was raised to the level of my own country back in the capital. Diplomatic life is not always easy. And sometimes the more effective way of a country getting his or her way is to get rid of the person who is presenting a particular view. And this is essentially what the attempt was on the part of that country. You say, well, we speak with the leadership in the capital and get Ambassador Hackett removed. But I was fortunate here again. My Prime Minister at the time and Minister of Foreign Affairs, they called and they gave me the support. And as I said, eventually we got the leader of that particular country, to agree. That was a proud moment for me, and I cherish the experience, and I will always remember it.
So you've shared with us a few stories. You've shared with us your greatest achievement. What do you think was the greatest challenge in your relations and your work in the UN?
I think it would have to come down to interpersonal. Sometimes you do not get the fullest support from some country representative that you think that you would want to get, and you just have to keep working at it. If not necessarily every day, but set up a strategy of seeking how much to. So interpersonal relationships and how to build up a sense of confidence that you can win over the other person on your side, I think would be one of the big challenges.
Can you share with us where we can find your book?
Oh, yes. At the present time, in Barbados, they are available in two of the bookstores, the Pages bookstore, and I know there are a number of branches around Cape Shepherd and the Warren supermarket, and also Cloister. And here again, Cloister, they have the three locations, one in the that I know of, the three in the city, and the one in the city, one at the Sheraton Mall and the Dome Mall, also in Warren. So they would be the main places. I will be, I've delayed in doing this, but it will be done shortly. I'm finalizing having it on Amazon, but I'm not certain if this is going to be a big attraction for those living in Barbados. That was my intention of reaching out to those who are anywhere in the globe, in case they wanted to get hold of the book.
Thank you, Dr. Hackett, for sharing with us. We truly enjoyed having you here today. And we want to encourage our viewers and our listeners to make sure to get a copy of the book, The Life of a Diplomat, representing a small island state at the United Nations. We want to wish you every success, even in your retirement years. And we hope that you will continue to share from your wealth of experience with our young persons and with our nation, and encouraging us to recognize that on the global stage, we too can have a voice.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us.